directly to our second panel. The fact that we do everything online means we don't need coffee break. We can all go for a coffee or a tea during the sessions. Our second panel is a really kind of very timely contemporary one, discussing the Russian Orthodox Church and the war. And we have four great contributors. First, Dima Adamsky from Reichman University in Israel, Sergei Chapnin, from Fordham University in the US, Jason Roberts from the University of Texas at Austin, also in the US, and Paul Kolster from University of Oslo in Norway. So four great specialists who will be able to help us looking at the different aspects on how the church is supporting or not supporting the war. So let's begin with Dima. Dima, the floor is yours.
All right, can you hear me well then? Yes, excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon. It's very good to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. I'd like to talk very briefly about the Russian Orthodox Church in war towards the battlefield and on the battlefield itself. It's very much work in progress towards forthcoming book on politicization of the Russian military and militarization of Russian politics, but my findings are very preliminary. What I will do right now in the next 10 minutes is just to talk briefly about three things. First of all, I'll outline a pre-war model of state-church cooperation in military affairs. Then I will make a reality check how this model basically demonstrated itself in this war, and I will offer several preliminary conclusions. Just to put my main argument up front, I would argue that Russian Orthodox Church and Russian military clergy are playing important role in this war effort, both on the front and in the rear. Then I would argue that clerical contribution is of course lower than initially expected, but it's more significant than that of political officers. The Zampolits within Russian military responsible for moral, psychological, political maintenance of the troops. And finally, I would argue that clerical role in the military is likely to grow if, of course, certain conditions materialize. So let me start from outlining the cooperation model, how it emerged. Basically, I would argue that it's emerged during the Syrian operation, and what we see right now on the battlefield and in the front is an extension of the model that crystallized back then. During the operation, and Russian military intervened in Syria in 2015, and it is present there till this very day, the Russian Orthodox Church provided the Kremlin with deliverables in three spheres, so some sort of three-layer model or triadic model of cooperation emerged. First of all, there was a domestic contribution. The church legitimized operational goals and conduct of the military for the general public and worked to maintain domestic support for it. Then there was external contribution. It was an effort to attain public political support abroad through ecclesiastical diplomacy, engaging foreign officials, foreign denominations within and outside Orthodox world. And finally, there was very significant activism on the battlefield, what I would call combat contribution. It was mainly about providing meanings of the operation and a sense of purpose for the servicemen, injecting higher level of motivation and morale, enhancing unit cohesion, and also assisting in dealing with PTSD on their battlefield. In this last field, in the field of combat contribution, from the beginning of the operation, military priests have been providing uninterrupted pastoral care to the troops. There were temples that were constructed on the main basis of Russian deployment in Khmeimim and in Tartus in Syria, and rituals, ceremonies, pastoral procedures, I will be happy to elaborate on those, which emerged in the decade prior to the operation were replicated in Syria. Grosso modo, we're looking about 40 clerics that had been rotated through Syria to provide pastoral care to the troops. Political military leadership, Russian political military leadership expected to replicate this model that emerged in Syria in future operations. The key date here is 2018, when the clergy becomes part, military clergy, becomes part of the main military political directorate, basically resurrection of the Soviet Главпур, Главное военно-политическое управление, within the Ministry of Defense, also known as Zampolits, political officers or commissars. Now, since 2018, this organ comprises zampolits, the political officers, military clerics, and military psychologists. And commanders, since then, are, at least in theory, seeing clergy as a tool to maintain moral psychological resilience of the troops on the battlefield. And then this war in Ukraine starts. So let's now check the modus operandi of the ROC, of the Russian Orthodox Church in this war, against this model of three-front cooperation. So what's happening on the domestic front? In the domestic realm, we're basically looking at agitprop, at mobilization, and what they call gumanitarka, or humanitarian assistance. When it comes to agitprop, Moscow Patriarchate explains the causes of war. It legitimizes its strategic goals and frames the image of enemy more probably than any other actor within the system. The main motive is to present this as both just geopolitical contest and a holy war. The main challenge, by the way, and contribution is to reconcile a cognitive dissonance among the servicemen. Why do we kill brothers in faith, and why do we bring destruction to the heart of the Holy Rus? By the way, this first task of domestic legitimization is much more challenging for the church than the one that was in Syria. Also, a novelty when compared to Syria, its emergence of some sort of martyrdom narrative. From the patriarch to rank-and-file commanders and priests, they frame combat activities, quite often frame combat activities and combat sacrifice as repentance, покаяние, and indulgence, отпущение of sins. Mobilization. Priests, especially those that return from the front or have been to the front, deliver sermons in mobilization centers for draftees and also for reservists. And when it comes to humanitarian help, gumanitarka, the Patriarchy, Moscow Patriarchy, coordinates collection and encourages collection of humanitarian help, clothes, food, and money in parishes and dispatches it to the front. It even serves, to a certain extent, as communication channel between the military and society. It connects families of drafted and mobilized with people in the front, and of course provides pastoral care to those that are dispatched. When it comes to external missions, ecclesiastical diplomacy in this operation is meager relative to Syria. Most of external energy goes to a new front, which is a struggle with the schism within the Orthodox world, Raskol. The main novelty that is emerging, however, in the external area of operations is the participation of Russian Orthodox Church, of Moscow Patriarchy, in Kremlin's nuclear coercive messaging. In other words, Patriarch and the Church serve as some sort of multiplier of effectiveness for Kremlin's strategic signaling. Previously, this nexus worked and was existent, but it worked the other way around. It was Kremlin that was exploiting an image of a faith-driven actor to enhance its nuclear coercion. And right now, both actors basically leaning on each other. And in this regard, in the recent episode towards a meeting of NATO states in Ramstein base, with the decision to expand assistance to Ukraine, and ecclesiastical and state reactions to it are very well illustrating this trend. Most importantly, and that's the third point, combat mission. So what are we looking at? What is the actual contribution of the church on the battlefield itself? How many clerics are there, and what is their modus operandi? So, as I said, it's still a war in progress, and their situation is emerging and changing all the time. But basically, at every moment, at every given moment, there are about 20 official and 20 non-official, штатные and внештатные military priests, and among them non-military priests who decide to volunteer to the front. Since the start of the operation, about 100 priests have been rotated through the front. In general, in the Russian military today, at least nominally, there are about 260 positions for military priests, and about 200 positions of those have been stuffed. Now, trips to the front last from 2 weeks to a month. Pastors rarely stay for more than 1 or 3 days within a unit. Usually they don't live with the units, but rotate between them. Overall, if we just initially estimate what are we looking at, like elsewhere in the Russian military in this war, it's a systemic bardak with incremental wartime adaptation. By the way, initially it turned out that there was even no regulation for the clergy for the wartime and in the war zone. initial impulse to penetrate, if you wish, the front lines was rather grassroots. In the first months, priests from local parishes just tried to infiltrate the battlefield to provide pastoral care. Since May, Ministry of Defense approved for the clerics with combat experience to get to the front. In June, the position of the chief military cleric has been upgraded to the rank of protoprosviter, which is the replica of their Tsarist legacy. And since early autumn, we'll clearly see how Moscow Patriarchate is trying to co-opt these bottom-up initiatives, and we clearly observe the top-down guidance on the part of Russian Orthodox Church and the Ministry of Defense. The Patriarchy is bringing the problem of the deficit of the military clergy to the public sphere. There are crash courses for training of clerics volunteers in tactical medicine and preparation for the front. There is a staff work in the Ministry of Defense to regulate their wartime and frontline status and to expand their presence. What do they actually do on the battlefield? Grosso modo, it is around this principle, this term of moral, psychological, political maintenance. Морально-психологическое, политическое обеспечение войск. This is the main field of clerical conduct. I would even argue that they substitute political officers, an institution that discredited itself during the war. On the eve of the invasion, there was no moral, psychological, political preparation of the troops. Eventually, in the first month of the war, soldiers operate in informational vacuum and under informational pressure of the enemy. There is a confusion, disorientation, demotivation, and cognitive dissonance. There is no one to explain to the soldiers clearly what are they fighting for, why they are killed, and why they are killing others. Commanders during this time report on the need to struggle with counter-propaganda, rumors, depression, and PTSD. Now, zampolit political officers that are in the troops, they can't really deliver due to the pre-war and intra-war challenges. First of all, they lack ammunition for agitation and propaganda. They don't have national ideology. And during the war, which is, by the way, the pre-war problem, but during the war, the Kremlin left war aims, enemy image, and the end state of this war blurred and constantly changing. By the way, also, Zampolit's political officers also lack proper preparation. There were no graduates of NMPD when the war started. And on the tactical level, if we're looking on the platoon leaders or company leaders, they're just too young and unexperienced to conduct moral psychological support and to motivate under fire. Now, clerics that arrives to the troops, they were capable to a certain extent to address these deficiencies. They don't need a state to provide them with ideological religious ammunition for agitprop, they have their own. They know how to comfort psychologically. Even simple conversations and confessions help servicemen to deal with stress and PTSD. And they benefit from informality. They are not regular officers, and they're not associated in the psyche of the servicemen with the establishment, which in many cases, and military high command, that in many cases discredited itself during this war. It's too early to estimate the actual impact. It's really too early to judge. There are different competing views on that. But next to critical views, there is a significant number of sources that argue that clerics, although insufficient in numbers, has been more contributing on the battlefield than Zampolits. According to accounts from soldiers, from officers, from military bloggers, voyenkory, their presence and pastoral care contributed to combat effectiveness, unit cohesion, discipline, accomplishment of orders, and dealing with PTSD. Just to sum up, so what do we have, what are we looking at in sum? The Russian Orthodox Church and military clergy have been active in internal domestic missions, legitimation of the supreme command, goals of war, and generation of public support. When it comes to external missions, there is a transition of focus and a novelty, this contribution to nuclear coercion that I mentioned. And when it comes to military and combat missions, in many cases they demonstrated underperformance, at least when compared to the initial expectations. Their numbers in the front are lower than there is an actual demand for them, and they are also lower in numbers than Zampolits, political officers, but they contribute to moral psychological state of the troops more than the Zampolits. Also, wartime adaptation of the Russian Orthodox Church, at least so far, looks to be more impressive than wartime adaptation of the main military political directorate, but still these efforts, these ecclesiastical efforts on the battlefield hardly address the monumental challenge of the Russian military in the field of moral, psychological maintenance and political ideological work. The sources of this underperformance are similar to other sources of Russian military deficiencies in this war: a traditional cultural pathology of pokazucha and the gap between theory and practice, organizational problems. There was no subordination clarity for the clerics, no systemic preparation, no formal regulation of their status in wartime, and no social security. So when we're looking ahead, there is, of course, a very clear meeting of military ecclesiastical interests that may lead to expansion of the clerical role in the military. In the front lines, there was a clear high demand for ecclesiastical contribution. On the part of the church, it is eager to expand its role in the military, and in fact, the war opens an opportunity to achieve long-lasting organizational goals of the church, and clerics themselves who are in the front, which come back from the front, report on professional spiritual satisfaction and feeling of genuine demand from the troops. So if the position of the Russian Orthodox Church within the military grows, I would argue that the pre-war tensions and certain competition of influence between the clergy and the Zampolits is likely to intensify. I will stop here. I will be delighted to elaborate during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dima. Wonderful presentation on the contribution of the church on the battlefield. Now I would like to give the floor to Sergei Chapnin, who will be discussing more the kind of theology of war in sermons and public speeches of the church. Sergei, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. And yes, let me bring a theological dimension to our discussion. I think it's quite important to remember that we should not leave aside the theological problems right now when we're discussing the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in this war. Actually, I should say that what has been happening in the Russian Orthodox Church in recent months resembles a kind of suicide attempt. I cannot imagine that in the nearest future, the Russian Orthodox Church will remain as it has been for the past 30 years, for the period that we'll call the period of religious revival in Russia, or even 80 years. And when I say 80 years, I mean from September 1943, when Stalin decided to end the era of persecution of the church, and in fact re-established the church and allowed to re-elect the patriarch in the atheistic Soviet Union. This kind of construction, the church, the loyal church in the state, sort of is the basic model for all this time. And when we were speaking about religious revival in 90s or 2000s, the idea was that something significantly had changed in these church-state relations. But in fact, the basic thing, the idea that our church and state are partners, are still there. And it was, I think it's a great challenge for the church historians sort of to rethink this model back in 50s, 60s, and 70s, so that the roots of this cooperation that we have now between Putin's regime and the hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church will be much clearer if we sort of have this deeper historical dimension. Going back to this 11 months of war, well, actually a lot of things have been said and done, not only to understand the position of the Russian Orthodox Church, but also to examine the collaboration between the clergy and especially the problem of justification by the church military crimes. And the crucial point in this justification is sort of crafting our pseudo-theological arguments by the official church. And of course, I have to emphasize that few priests in the church opposed the war and publicly opposed the war. But since time is short, I will speak only about those who justify and support this invasion. So for years, Patriarch Kirill has claimed that his voice is the voice of the Russian Orthodox Church par excellence. So, and from the first days of invasion, he took a really kind of clear and transparent standpoint. He did not condemn the war. Instead, he immediately began to offer arguments to excuse and justify it. In his wartime sermons, Patriarch consistently unfolded the ideas, unfold in a way a new concept, which could be called a kind of in commerce theology of war. And let me remind you our basic arguments in chronological order. I will pick up few of them, and of course, you know, these are points, these quotations, but just to remind you. So March 6th, almost 2 weeks after the 2 weeks after the invasion. What is happening in international relations today is about more than just politics. It is about something else and far more important than politics. It is about human salvation, about where humanity will be. So I will point out here that he puts this war in a perspective of human salvation. That's the first thing. Now, from the same sermon. Therefore, today on Forgiveness Sunday, on the one hand, as your pastor, I call everyone for forgiveness of sins and offenses, including those wherein the challenging to do so, where people are at war with one and another. But forgiveness without justice is surrender and weakness. Therefore, forgiveness must be accompanied by the indispensable right to stand on the side of light, on the side of God's truth, on the side of God's commandment. And this the popular sentence. All of this shows that we are engaged in a struggle with no physical but metaphysical significance. So what is important here is, first of all, that the Patriarch tries to sort of to suggest a theological argument for the war, this idea of human salvation. The second thing is quite interesting, and I just noticed it a few days ago, that Patriarch is saying that it is important to be on the side of light, on the side of God's truth. And that's a tricky thing, because in the gospel we know from the gospel we know that we should be the light. We should not be on the side of light. We should be the light to the Christian. Should be the light to the world. We should not be on the side of God's truth, but we should proclaim the God's truth. We should not be on the side of God's commandments, but we are called to sort of to fulfill these commandments. And in a way, it's one of the numerous attempts to put the kind of all these religious concepts in a secular perspective. So if Patriarch, it's like the same with traditional values that were discussed earlier. In my contribution to this post-secular conflicts project, I wrote that the concept of traditional values is a substitute to the gospel and to our commandments, because when Patriarch pretends to address the broader audience, say the nation, and he will use only religious terms, the vast majority of the population will not understand him. But if he will switch from commandments to traditional values, the audience will be much broader. And here is the same, or I guess that here is the same, he is using the same, he puts kind of the concepts in the same way, that, it is not that necessary to fulfill the commandments, but just feel kind of emotionally that you're on the side of commandments. That will be enough for you to sort of to be a part of the church, to feel that you're a Christian, and so on. Now, what is interesting, that Patriarch Kirill is not ashamed, and actually he insists that God's truth is on the side of the aggressor, and that the battle has begun are not so much kind of political or other earthly reasons. And this opens a floor for a lot of different interpretations. So I'm jumping to September when Patriarch made, I think, the strongest sermon of this kind of war circle, when he said, we know that today many people are dying in the fields on the war fields. The church prays that this battle will end as quickly as possible, and then he goes back to this dead. That those who dies in military service, he undoubtedly committing an equal act to a sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others, and so we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins and that has committed. So this concept of sacrifice is a core concept of any religion, and of course of Christianity as well. And when you connect unconditionally the death of a person with the sacrifice, that's a typical a typical attempt to remove the sacrifice from religious context into a context of so-called civil religion. So that's a kind of patriotism, but nothing to do with the sacrifice of Christ. So that gives an interesting perspective of kind of influence of Muslim thought on Patriarch personally, and in a way on Orthodox theology. Ukrainian author Sergei pointed out that Patriarch Kirill's arguments are closer to political Islam than to traditional Orthodox theology. Now, November 7th, the sermon of Metropolitan Mitrofan of Murmansk. He's one of the kind of active supporters of war. He himself is a former Navy or Russian Navy officer. So what he is saying, we pray for our warriors who are now there in Ukraine, holding the front under the united forces of evil. All of Europe worshipped the Prince of Darkness. And what is most terrible is that our brothers, the Slavs, the Ukrainians, bow down. They are the same Russian people, and we can't let that happen. That is why we have fallen in line and we are holding our ground. And in fact, he repeats in a less sophisticated manner what Patriarch Kirill preaches about the battle of good and evil. And give this quotation as an example that not only Kirill is totally on Putin's side, but in fact, the vast majority of our bishops and the majority of clergy. The difference between bishops and clergy, as far as I understand the situation in the church now, is that bishops in Russia have to support the war publicly. That's the comment that was given from Moscow Patriarchate, from Patriarch Kirill. So they can't step aside. They have to say something in support of war publicly. You cannot find this on their web pages, but they really do that. So what are, I'm running out of time, just the
yeah, if you could summarize, yes.
Yeah, just summarize our few ideas. So right now we are at the point when we have to define, can we consider these views as a kind of new Russian heresy? And provide an in-depth theological analysis and condemn this heresy. And I see three options or trajectories for the analysis. Yes, that could be heresy in a traditional point of view, but there are some problems because this heresy is not connected to Christology or Trinitarian issues. So there will be a problem, but well, maybe somebody will sort of provide arguments. The second thing is the second option is a kind of non-traditional understanding of heresy, that of, for example, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, like Father Cyril Havarun suggested, that the heresy could be anything that is kind of wrapped in Christian tradition, but in fact is not. And my approach is that what we see now is the kind of final stage of kind of shaping, developing a post-Soviet civil religion, which should be separated from the Christianity, from the Orthodox tradition, and I think that will be the most fruitful way, because that could include not only this theology of war of recent months, but also the concept of Russian world in general and traditional values, and I think that will be the main discussion among theologians for the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergei, for this wonderful analysis. I will now give the floor to Jason, who will, in a sense, continue that discussion on power and authority in Russia's anti-modern Orthodox imaginary, so also linking that to theology. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Make sure I'm not muted. There we go. Yes. Well, I should preface this by saying I also study theology, although I'm not as a believer, but as an intellectual history of a particular kind of philosophy. And I came to the topic of Russian Orthodox concepts of power and authority through a kind of side door. I started out as a scholar of the European Renaissance and Reformation, working on Catholic and Protestant Europe. My interest concerned the social and political implications of the incompatible ontological assumptions of scholastic Aristotelian Catholic theologians and their largely Platonic Protestant counterparts. So there's no way around this, because the conclusion that I want to share with you has to do with what happens when you have religions that base their metaphysics on an Aristotelian inductive model and pit them against religions that are Platonic deductive in their metaphysics. And I hope that my conclusion will illuminate part of the co-belligerence of various holders of, quote, traditional values, because I think the term is loaded metaphysically as well as politically. There are also, of course, there's a third option, the humanist philosophers from the Renaissance, like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and so on and so forth, who were drawing their Neoplatonic and from Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, which is a third metaphysical option represented now by Alexander Dugin, most notably. I realized that because of their different metaphysical starting points, a lot of the ins and outs of Reformation theology, this is when I started my research generally before I discovered the Russian implications of this, their arguments could be understood as proxy arguments over underlying metaphysics that determine what constitutes a knowable fact, what we can know, theory of knowledge, as well as the source and legitimacy of temporal authority to use coercive force. Who is justified and empowered to govern and to wage war? And where I'm going with this is the answer follows logically depending on the metaphysics that you start with, and they're not reconcilable. My first step in the direction of researching Russian Orthodoxy came with the realization that Dugin was drawing heavily from Renaissance Hermetic philosophy through thinkers, post-Renaissance thinkers like Guénon and Julius Evola. Of course, his fourth political theory is far from canonical orthodoxy, but the nature of Dugin's Eurasianist project requires him to attempt to reconcile various religious, which is to say metaphysical, assumptions and bring them under a single big tent, with Russian Orthodoxy as its center pole. Once I realized what Dugin was attempting, I started looking more carefully at orthodoxy. What I found, and this is what I would like to share with you all, is that both the reason and the rhetoric of the reactionary anti-modernism we're seeing from Russian Orthodoxy and its co-belligerents are practically the same as the anti-scholasticism, which is to say the anti-Aristotelianism of Reformation theologian Martin Luther and the Renaissance humanists. So we've been here before. I'd like to note that Calvinism presents a separate problem as it quickly became very Aristotelian in its orientation, but we'll get to that at the end. Moreover, just like when the previous metaphysical battle royale happened during the late Middle Ages and early modern period, there are currently proponents of both Platonic and Hermetic ontologies. So Orthodoxy representing Platonism, Dugin and other ideologues, philosophers representing Hermeticism. Furthermore, just as in the 16th century, both the Platonic and Hermetic positions are opposed to Aristotelianism, the same Aristotelianism that is the epistemological patrimony of the West, and which in many ways marks modernity. So the point of my presentation is that there are a number of important implications to this realization. However, before I get into those, I wanted to make a brief digression in order to explain what I mean by scholastic Aristotelianism, Platonic Platonism, and Hermetic humanism. Again, these distinctions are important insofar as they pertain to theories of knowledge, which means the production of knowledge and how we can know it and what can be considered truth. So in political science terms, you know, that we are controlling facts and the nature of facts by our initial choice of metaphysics. Importantly, and this point is often lost, within each of these medical frameworks, different conclusions follow logically from the different metaphysical base assumptions. In the simplest terms, Aristotelianism is materialist, Platonism is idealist, and Hermeticism tries to be both, but fails, although it does have certain rhetorical advantages. In the West, scholastic Aristotelianism won out during the Enlightenment, and as a result, the vast majority of our own reasoning in the modern West is rooted in inductive Aristotelian thinking, scientific method. The idea that we can learn through observation of material evidence and that the authority to govern is derived from the consent of the governed, or the greater part thereof, are both logical conclusions of the inductive metaphysics of Aristotelianism. By contrast, the idea that knowledge, truth must be revealed because the material world is a distorted projection of a greater reality, which exists either in the realm of forms, if you're a Platonist, or in the mind of God, if you're an Augustinian, and that the authority to exercise coercive force issues from an all-sovereign God down through a feudal hierarchy, is a logical and even necessary conclusion of the deductive reasoning of Platonism. So what you start with determines what is just in the end analysis. It's worth noting that this kind of Platonism is something that Russian Orthodoxy shares with early Lutheranism and the pre-scholastic cosmology of late 4th and early 5th century theologian Augustine of Hippo. Importantly, this kind of Platonism also permits one to reject material evidence in favor of idealism. Ideas are more real than material reality if you take the Platonist route. Finally, there's the Hermetic logic. It's the least familiar and most convoluted, which probably accounts for the strangeness of many of Dugin's arguments. The logic of Hermeticism is correlative from our modern Western perspective, the perspective of the scientific method. Hermetic logic represents a logical fallacy related to the correlation causation fallacy. It dictates that correlation is evidence of ontology in the way that a reflection in a mirror implies the existence of an object outside of a mirror. So a greater truth that we can discern from sort of fractured instantiations around us, but still know that what must be is more real than the reality around us. So Hermeticism has the specific practical advantage that it allows you to adduce truths. So to come up with new traditional values that have always been there and cite a kind of evidence around you. As a metaphysics, it supports claims of, absolute transcendental truth, to which material reality can and should be made to conform, like traditional values. Now, back to the implications. First, this has all happened before. In the 15th and 16th century, Platonists and Hermeticists rebelled against Aristotelian scholasticism with a series of arguments about the nature of knowledge and coercive authority. Popes and emperors engaged in heated public polemics and sometimes power plays, like excommunications and kidnappings. Part of the drama is playing out again now in Russia. Then as now, the ultimate goal of the machinations was to control both knowledge and authority by undermining the paradigm of inductive reasoning and leaving only a Platonic deductive totalitarian paradigm. If material reality is inconsistent with the ideal form, then something must be wrong with reality, right? Thus, the argument that there's no such thing as a Ukrainian is a Platonic argument. Likewise, the argument that Russia is justified in invading and annexing parts of Ukraine in defense of Russia presupposes an ideal Russia, the reality of this Russia that does not exist, to which reality must be made to conform. Second, because of this history, such thinking has a substantial intellectual tradition of its own. The patriarch's call to war in Ukraine, promising the forgiveness of sins, bears more than a passing resemblance to the Deus Vult, which is God wills it, with which Pope Urban II justified the First Crusade. The infamous papal 1308 papal bull of Pope Boniface VIII, the Unam Sanctam, which declares no salvation outside the church, and asserts the temporal authority of the papacy, as well as the 1302 De Ecclesiastica Potestate concerning the power of the Church of Gilles de Rome, which represents the papacy as the sole source of all temporal authority, also warrant review as the Russian Patriarch goes about excommunicating and anathematizing other patriarchs, like Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople and Patriarch Theodoros of Alexandria and all of Africa. His anathemas mean that the Patriarch of Russia is free to unfurl Ruski Mir, or his version of Orthodox civilization, and expand it into other patriarchates by denying the legitimacy of his brother patriarchs. He's making space for more Russian Orthodoxy, which leaves him poaching, as it were, in the patriarchal jurisdictions that he's deemed to have illegitimate leadership. Third, not only are we seeing the Russian Patriarch behaving like a medieval pope in the name of Orthodox civilization, and Russian Orthodoxy functioning as a soft power for the Kremlin outside of Russia, we're also witnessing, and I'm grinning because I didn't expect to have somebody already introduce this, the articulation of a Russian Orthodox doctrine of just war, which is to say possibly a heresy, or at least a reformation within Orthodoxy. It is a schism if it goes much further. So the communion of Orthodox churches does not acknowledge a concept of just war in the sense that the West does. According to Orthodox theology, I'm outranked here, I believe, but I'm pretty sure my footnotes are right. War is never justified, and certainly never holy war. Now, Orthodox theologians admit that sometimes war is necessary, but it is never just. Yet we're seeing a very Augustinian articulation of just war in all but name, both from the Patriarch, and we find it spelled out in the clearest possible terms in Ivan Ilyine's On Resistance to Evil by Force, which has become immensely popular. So the conversations about Putin's philosopher aside, which I would say is a misnomer, it would have to be Putin's theologian, Pache Snyder and friends, but even that I don't think is correct. It is just a clear articulation of something that is much broader spread. I agree that Ilyine is incredibly important as a marker of the right radicalization in Russian thought, but disagree with the analysis as Putin's philosopher. I'm currently preparing an analysis of his text that compares to Martin Luther's. Here's a very important point in terms of this has been done before. Martin Luther, the Reformation theologian, wrote Against the Murderous Hordes of Thieving Peasants in 1525, which is effectively a doctrine of just class war, so serving the interests of the ruling class. And this is what Ilyine's On Resistance to Evil by Force seems to look like the most. Final implication, at least for the present talk, in at least one very significant way, the far right in Russia is not nearly so fragmented as it is often presented. As we know, the Western Catholic Church eventually embraced, to some extent, the inductive reasoning of Aristotle through scholastic theology of Thomas Aquinas, and this led to the Enlightenment and the scientific method. His so-called ontologic, in his theology, Aquinas attempted to reconcile Augustine's Platonism with Aristotle. It was forced and unconvincing, but brought Aristotelian think into religion in the West. So anti-Aristotelianism of both Orthodox Platonism and reactionary Hermeticism like Dugin, in all of their articulations, form a co-belligerency. They're not united in their ultimate goals, but they all share the fight to undermine trust in the scientific method and representative government. This means that anti-modern, anti-Western, anti-Catholic, anti-Protestant, anti-Enlightenment, anti-parliamentarianism, I would say even a certain amount of Euroscepticism, are all pieces of a larger whole in their shared rejection of inductive reasoning. The danger isn't that a Dugin or an Ilyin will become Putin's guru or philosopher, but that collectively and cumulatively, they and scores of others will tip the scale away from evidence-based material reasoning and make it very difficult to counter the Orthodox Platonic imperial religious narratives. So I'm not implying that Russians are incapable of inductive reasoning, and I'm not suggesting that there's so much religiosity in Russia that this is going to be the problem for that reason. I'm suggesting a certain amount of infiltration and overthrow of the fundamental assumptions of the public discourse, so that the language of disagreement becomes harder and harder to leverage against the religious rhetoric. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jaden. I think it was a really fundamental discussion on the kind of the deep theological or philosophical elements that explain this kind of co-belligerence and a kind of global view on how you articulate, right, the relationship to truth and to doctrine and so on. So thank you so much. And now I would like to give the floor to Paul to discuss opposition to the war in Ukraine among the Russian Orthodoxy, and then we will have time for the Q&A. So Paul, the floor is yours. You're muted.
There we are, right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. Misha is not presenting, or what? I thought we need to leave a space also for him.
No, Misha Suslov is presenting in the next panel.
Right, good. Anyway, well, I have prepared a 10,000-word text, which I have trimmed down to almost nothing. And it's still longer than I can present in 12 minutes. Therefore, I have decided that I will start with the conclusions, so that I'm sure that I have time to present them to you, because that's where I want to have your feedback. I need your feedback there. So when it comes to opposition to the war in Ukraine among Russian Orthodox believers, it has been such opposition, but just as it has been in other segments of Russian society, but the strength of this opposition should not be exaggerated. The Moscow Patriarchate, it seems to me, has been quite capable of containing overt expressions of anti-war attitudes in their ranks, and even to force some critics to recant. So why have we not heard more stories about opposition to the Russian aggression in Ukraine among Russian Orthodox believers? Is it because few people have had the will or the courage to express them publicly, or is it that these protests have not reached the headlines? Here are some possible explanations, which I would like to hear your opinion on. First, the majority of Russians do support the war, and this is probably true also of Orthodox believers, although we have no way of finding out how large this majority is. Two, perhaps many participants in the demonstrations that took place in March and somewhat later were Orthodox believers, but were not reported as such in the media, since they were expressing their political opinions, not their Christian faith. Three, some may have been held back by fear of reprisals or persecution. However, there is little evidence that many have been exposed to any kind of severe repressions when they have expressed opposition to the war. Even Father Burdin in Kostroma, the most famous case, who was one of the first to be fined for discrediting the army, 35,000 rubles. After first having left Russia, after a couple of months, he felt safe to return to Russia. 4, the reason why Father Burdin's protest was picked up by the media was not that he criticized the war effort in his sermon, but that someone in his congregation decided to inform on him, and the local authorities acted upon this denunciation. It is theoretically possible that tens or even hundreds of priests have done the same, but have gone under the radar because they have more loyal congregations. However, while it is tempting to draw conclusions from silence, so to speak, the absence of evidence to the contrary, we are here on very shaky methodological ground. So with regard to the congregations of the Russian Orthodox Church in other countries, particularly in the West, the situation is very different. But also here, it seems that the church leadership in Moscow has been able to keep control to a remarkable degree. For instance, Archpriest Andrei Kardochkin in the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Madrid, himself a harsh critic of the Putin regime, he maintains that the question of leaving the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate is not on the agenda. A number of centrally placed church leaders have penned, in the Western world, have penned sharply worded statements against Russia's war in Ukraine, and specifically against Patriarch Kirill's support for it. So why don't they take the next step and leave Kirill's jurisdiction? It would seem that it does exist a viable alternative in the West European Exarchate of the Constantinople Patriarchate, which has several Russian language congregations under its umbrella. Very many of the local Russian churches in Western countries have many Ukrainian parishioners as well, and the vast majority of them would no doubt eagerly welcome such a move. Alexei Makarkin, a keen observer of contemporary Russian Orthodox affairs, believes that the most important restraining factor is the age-old, deep-seated mutual suspicion between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Constantinople Patriarchate, which has rubbed off also on ordinary believers. Theoretically, an alternative would be to ask to be accepted into another autocephalous church. But most of them have not broken off Eucharistic communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, and therefore Makarkin believes that they most likely would not accept such renegades into their ranks. So a final possible explanation could be that the Russian Orthodox believers with anti-war and anti-Putin convictions may hope that it shall be possible to influence developments in their church from the inside. They refuse to accept that the current state of affairs must be permanent and look forward to the day when Patriarch Kirill has either come to his senses or been deposed. Today, in the words of the apostle, this may be a hope against all hope, but it can only materialize if they remain within the church. So especially the last speculation, I would like to have some ideas on from people who are have more contacts in Russia than I have at the time being. So some of my material. The most well-known expression of opposition towards the war in Ukraine among Russian Orthodox believers is the collective statement published on 1st March last year, signed by priests and deacons. The number of signatures now stand at 293, among which a considerable amount appears to be based outside Russia. I quote, "We respect the God-given freedom of man and believe that the people of Ukraine should make their choice themselves, not at gunpoint, without pressure from West or East." End quote. So this document has been criticized for wanting to be even-handed, criticizing both West and East. But several of the signatories to this appeal have individually been willing to express themselves less diplomatically. One of them is priest monk Dmitry Pershin. On his Facebook page, he declared that he was ashamed of the attack on Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Kherson. For what? To make the survivors fall in love with Russia? Forgive us if you can. We cannot forgive ourselves. End quote. Another of the priests who had signed the statement on March 1st, Ivan Burdin, in a small village church outside Kostroma, was one of the first Russians to be fined for his protest. He was not deterred by this fine, but continued to publish on his Telegram channel strong denunciations of Russia's war in Ukraine and of the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the war. I quote, "It is said about us, whoever offends one of these little ones who believe in me, it should be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and that he was drowned in the depth of the sea." With this, of course, is what Jesus said. End quote. So Boudin was in effect saying that the Russian Orthodox Church could no longer call itself Christian. It had betrayed Christ. Bourdin had posted his views on the website of his local congregation and expected it to be read by some 20 people, but ended up addressing a world audience. A score of journalists descended upon his small village to get an interview with him. First the local press, then the national Russian media, and finally international media. And this media coverage, both in Russia and abroad, was either neutral or favorable. Another incident of a one-person priestly rebellion was the case of Father Nikolai Platonov in Chelyabinsk. In April, he wrote, I quote, "Run, run! A crazy subhuman human is in power who will hold on to power at all cost. On the altar of his vanity, he will put thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, your children, as well as the children of a neighboring state. I do not see myself as part of this fascist government." Father Platonov's language was harsher than the words spoken against the war by Father Bourdin, but his action nevertheless made less waves, because by the time he had posted his views on the internet, he had already left the country. He was not prepared to risk arrest or play the role of a martyr. Among the higher clergy in Russia, no one had spoken out against the war. In June, Metropolitan Ilarion Alfeev was replaced as head of Synodal Department for External Church Relations and moved to a small diocese in Hungary. There has been some speculation that this could be a punishment for his failure to express explicit support for the war. But observers with inside information, like Sergei Chapnin here, believe that this demotion actually suited Ilarion rather well. He can now burnish his reputation in the West as a liberal, while he at the same time in his so-called exile can be useful to the Patriarchate as some kind of liaison officer in European Union. Russian Orthodox believers outside Russia can, of course, speak their mind freely without fearing arrest. In Western countries, not only public opinion, but also the political authorities are fiercely against this war, and any expression of sympathy or understanding for the Russian attack, or even failure to speak out against it, can easily lead to ostracism. So the current leader of the Estonian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Yevgeny, is an ethnic Russian from Russia, and after 24th of February, he for a long time did not publicly state any position on the war in Ukraine, and doubts had been sown with regard to his loyalty. In October, the Estonian Minister of Justice demanded a clear statement from him condemning the war. The minister even threatened that if she did not get a satisfactory answer, she might have to put a halt to his church activities in Estonia. In his reply, Yevgeny explicitly distanced himself from a notorious statement Kirill had made in the sermon the month before, already mentioned, according to which Russian servicemen who die in the line of military duty in this war will be cleansed of all their sins. And this statement was so egregious that no Christian of any denomination should have difficulty denouncing it as heresy. Already in March, Metropolitan Ioan of Western Europe had distanced himself sharply from one of the other tall tales which the Patriarch had presented, that the war in Ukraine was a metaphysical struggle, which also Chapnin had mentioned, and that the Russian aggression therefore was justified. And the Metropolitan explained that, I quote, "With all my respect for you, Your Holiness, of which I assure you once again, but also with infinite pain, I must bring to your attention that I cannot agree with such a reading of the gospel," unquote. Now, many people in the West would no doubt regard this continued respect which church leaders like Metropolitan Ian shows towards the Russian Patriarch as misplaced. It was probably a lame attempt, I believe, to navigate in an extremely difficult situation. All Russian Orthodox Church leaders in Western countries are exposed to harsh cross pressures from their ecclesiastical superiors in Moscow, from the political authorities in the country in which they live and work, and finally from their faithful. Among their flock, there are people of various ethnic backgrounds and political convictions, often both sympathizers and staunch opponents of the Russian aggression. In Lithuania, the local metropolitan, Inakenti, issued a statement in March condemning the Russian aggression against Ukraine. He stated that, I quote, Patriarch Kirill and I have different political views, unquote, but it did not break formal ties with Moscow, adding somewhat unconvincingly that the Patriarch's statement about the war in Ukraine were his private opinion. To a group of parish priests in the Lithuanian Orthodox Church, this was not good enough, and they refused to mention the Patriarch in their services. Inakenti denounced them harshly for this as schismatics who sinned gravely against God and the Church, and dismissed some of them. They then contemplated joining Constantinople Patriarchate, although this was not part of their original plan. Now I am almost done. In the Netherlands, an entire congregation, the Church of St. Nicolai in Amsterdam, did transfer to the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarch. In March, their bishop came to their church without prior notice, concerned that the priests had stopped naming the Patriarch in their services. He told them that their attitude had given rise to concern, not only in the Patriarchate, but also, I quote, in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, unquote. In the view of the clerics of St. Nicholas Church, the bishop had now crossed a red line, and in the upshot, they asked the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople to be admitted into his rank, into his jurisdiction, which was granted. But as I started to say, this is an isolated case. There has been no mass defection from the Western parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I wonder, as I want to hear your views why that should be the case. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul, for doing this great research, which I think is a really important one. Also, so we had 4 wonderful presentations, both on the more pragmatic, like on the ground aspect of the church relationship to the war, and the more kind of theological one. There were several questions. Maybe I will try to kind of put them by categories, and also try to give you, all of you, the floor for some round of questions. We have about 25 minutes. A question specifically to Dima: how would you assess the participation of cleric, military, chaplain in the humanitarian work of the church, namely the filtration camps and the deportation of Ukrainian children? So that's one very specific question. Also question from Jason, and probably would work also for Sergei. Are you arguing that Platonist epistemology plays a key role in Russian political culture, legitimizing political power on the basis of access to higher knowledge? If so, does that make Putin a philosopher king? Is it possible for the idealized conception of Russia, which includes Ukraine as part of Russia, to change? And can you expand on the implication as you see them? And another, and then maybe I give the floor first to Jason, potentially Sergei and Dima to do this first round, and then we will do a second one after. Dima, do you want to begin?
Yes, sure. I see there is another question about the priests coming to the front,
Yes.
and other signs of
Yes.
coming. If you please, I will just explore both, because on the first question that you asked, I don't think that I have seen any evidence, and it's a great question, but I don't think that I have seen any evidence with regards to the functioning of the priests in their filtration camps. I think I'm familiar with what is going on in the filtration camps, and also what their, in general terms, and what is their position of their Rosgvardia and other security services in this regard, and what they're doing there. But I don't think that as of now I came through any substantial evidence about priests there, but it's a great question. I don't have a good answer. Maybe one of my colleagues here can offer something. On the first question, however, I think I can offer a hypothesis, and my argument would be that, yes, that's basically the bottom line of my presentation, that since there is a clear meeting of interests between the Ministry of Defense and the general staff on the one hand, and people in the field also, which is probably the most important thing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Russian Orthodox Church, then I think there is it should come as no surprise if the number of military priests, both on the front and in general in the Russian armed forces, will increase. I offered several indications. So one, it's basically Moscow Patriarchate is co-opting this grassroots bottom-up initiatives. There is an open public critique on the part of direct and indirect on the part of Moscow Patriarchate on the Ministry of Defense with regards to its inability to make a proper use of this military clergy, the non-official ones. There is an upgrade of their rank of the chief military priest to the rank of protoprosviter, which can be a pure, if you wish, facade and symbolic move on the one hand, but on the other hand, it can be just the beginning of their more important trend. In the discourse, including the discourse of the clergy itself, until this war, the term military chaplains was usually preserved to the role of clerics in the armed forces of non-Russian militaries. And here we can clearly see how senior officials and senior hierarchs of the church use the term military chaplains to describe what military priests should do. And I think that's something that demonstrates the desire for upgrades. There is a staff work in the Ministry of Defense to expand the regulations to respond to the demand from the church. And the Patriarch himself is encouraging the priests to volunteer, and we see how procedures within their synodal department for their work with the military has been introduced. So I think the main reason would be that it's a rare window of opportunity for the church to materialize what it has been trying to do during the last 20 or 30 years with the varying level of success. My last point would be about the just war theory. I'm very happy that we are bringing this issue. This is something that I've been following in my previous work when I was trying to look at their role of the clergy within the Russian nuclear sector or nuclear community. It's there where, for the first time, we already have seen some discussions that are discussing the lack of the just war theory in their Orthodox tradition and the need in one, since their presence of the clerics within the military, but specifically within the nuclear sector, and the discussion on their appropriateness or the lack of blessing and sanctification of their nuclear weapons already generated these discussions in their last 10 years in the particular parts of their nuclear complex and also among the particular clerics. In the social foundations of their Russian Orthodox Church, and there are people here in the room much more knowledgeable than myself on this issue, already in the early 2000s, there were references to the Western just war theory. It was a very general one, but it was still mentioned. In the Syrian operation, it was the second splash of activity that also touched on the issue of their just war theory. Sergei mentioned in his presentation this framing of forces of light and forces of evil being on their side of these forces of light, or actually being the forces of light itself. Their genealogy of this discussion can be traced back also to their Syrian operation. So I think bringing in and discussing their just war theory is something that is very important, and that this war will further, I would argue, stimulate both within their Orthodox Church, but also in the community of, if you wish, military experts or military clerics that are trying to develop their own military or secular ideology for this war in general. Martyrdom narrative, it's definitely a novelty in their sermons of the Russian Orthodox Church if I compare the sermons delivered by the Patriarch and other clerics during the operation in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dima. Now I would like to give the floor to Jason. There was also a comment, Jason, on the fact, the paradox being that Kirill does not promote the concept of just war, but of just peace. And that's one of the paradox. I give you the floor, and then after I will have a question for Sergei and Paul. Yes. Jason, the floor is yours. Yes.
There we go. I'll start with the paradox. Respectfully, I disagree. I don't think it's a paradox. I think it is a question of marketing. Depending on what just peace permits, I would say there's no difference between that and just war. And looking at the offer of a remission of sins for killing other people, it's regardless what Patriarch Kirill calls it, it's Augustinian just war in my analysis, although I'd be happy to read something countering that. Briefly then, thank you, Peter, for your compliment. I don't think it makes Putin a philosopher king. I do think that there is a way in which this all goes together, and I have Marlene and my colleagues to thank for this insight. Think of traditional values, or what Patriarch Kirill calls holy tradition, as a realm of forms. Right? For those of you familiar with the way that Platonism works here, they don't require, traditional values don't require material evidence in a way that other things do. They represent this perfection toward which we should strive, which should be attained, and which justifies coercion in that direction for various soteriological, salvific reasons, the salvation of Russia, the salvation of the individual soul, but not, the traditional values or holy tradition, rather than being defined by evidence, are sort of defined by the increasing lack of evidence, right, which supports the decadence narrative and the decay narrative. But that's sort of a backwards definition of tradition, something for which there is little or no evidence, and yet it is treated as ultimate truth in the way that Platonic forms are. So I would say that's probably off the cuff, the clearest I've ever been able to tie those things together, and to the extent that can be used to justify Putin's power, or the power of the Patriarch in the Russian Orthodox Church, this control of what is true, and what is more true than holy tradition, right? Then yes, it does play in. There is a sort of Platonic logic at work in I forget Peter's wording, but in the mechanisms of power as well as in the production of knowledge. I see them as not separated. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And so we have a broad question from our colleague Boris Knor that is for Dima, but I think I would like to get Sergei and Paul perception, because it's a key question, and it's a broad one. Do you think that in the post-Soviet period, so in the 90s and 2000, when Russian society and the Russian state were not yet in favor of war and violence, the church was ahead of the state in its desire to justify military service and war, making pro-war statements, and trying to develop this kind of, a synergy between the military and the church. And I think it's a key question on the global discussion on the role of the church in not only accompanying the state at war now, but also in a sense, maybe preceding it in some of its aspect of some of its narrative. So I would be interested in having a kind of global discussion on that. Dima, would you like to launch the discussion? And then I would give the floor to Sergei, Paul, and maybe Jason also.
Yes, if I understood the question correctly, the current position of the Russian Orthodox Church, especially the way how Sergei presented it, the evolution of their theology or the emerging theology or the emerging military theology, and in general, their position of the church with regards to this war, to me, based on the previous research, reflects more continuity than change. That's a very natural progression of the trends that we can trace back to the 90s. And there was even, in a way, I was even surprised because if you remember Sergei's presentation, the first real wartime sermon was delivered actually on the 7th or 8th days of the war. And I was actually surprised. I expected it to be much earlier. But it's part of the general way how this war emerged. So the moral psychological maintenance or ideological escort of this war started as the war started, pretty much against their military doctrine of how things should unfold in Russian military. So this is just a way of saying that it's not counterintuitive and it's not puzzling the position that the Russian Orthodox Church took. Even Sergei made a very interesting point in the beginning. I think, Sergei, you used the term suicidal, that you qualified the current conduct, the current modus operandi as a possible epochal, if you wish, suicide of the church. Even, I think, if this is true, the sermons that the church is currently generating, or even their conceptual zeitgeist, the conceptual atmosphere that church is generating, it is very handy for a lot of people within the military establishment and defense establishment that basically lack national ideology for agitation and propaganda of the troops. And it's a very handy material for people to construct ideological justification of the war, for people outside of the church. So my hunch would be, Marlene, that even if, even if within the Orthodox Church or the church itself evolves in the direction that Sergei is outlining, there will be a lot of groups within the Russian strategic community and in the Russian, if you wish, illiberal community or neoconservative community that are providing meanings and narratives for decision makers just to ensure their ontological security. It would be used. So I would expect, first of all, I see the continuity in the current conduct of the church, but I would expect even more movement in this direction. I'm not saying that there will be a lot of people who will follow, but I can clearly see how transition in this more militarized direction emerges, especially because one of the biggest failures of the Russian military, and this is something that I understand better than the church, is the total lack of ideological and moral psychological support for the troops. And since their organ of military political officers totally discredited itself, there is an appetite, a drastic need for this type of input, especially since the Russian government apparently is likely to continue this operation, especially as we come to spring and summer. Probably we are looking at the forthcoming another splash of escalation, and in this splash of escalation with the potential further mobilization, a second wave of mobilization of Russian society, there is a dire need for their support that the church can provide. So that would be their opening remark.
Sorry, thank you, Dima. Sergei?
Yes, I would like to add that Patriarch Kirill considers himself to be our main ideological partner of Putin, of the state. We should keep in mind that that was Kirill who sold the concept of traditional values to Kremlin. That was Kirill who contributed a lot to the sort of development of the concept of Ruski Mir. And now I think Patriarch Kirill thinks that his role is is to be a kind of to suggest arguments for both for the state, for the military, and for the society, and of course for the church, are justifying the war and giving kind of perspective for kind of further development of these ideas. I would say, in a way, he is much more successful as a kind of creator of the ideological narratives than many other politicians and officials in Russia.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, I am a bit surprised about the question. If I understood it correctly, then we are asked whether the church pioneered some kind of militarized theology already in the 90s or so. And that means already under Alexei II. And so my answer to that, I guess, would be, even though I don't have any much to back it up with, no. I don't. The evidence I have does not support that, and I also logically I don't see any reason why that should. I completely agree with Sergei that the policy of the Russian Church under Kirill after the war started has been suicidal, and I don't see why anybody should embark on a suicidal trip voluntarily. I must say I'm surprised that Kirill has done so, and I believe that he has been forced to do so, but others may see him as a sort of an instigator of this. I beg to disagree. Even though from the entire hierarchy, there has been unison support for the war. I still believe, perhaps this is just my wishful thinking, that they are dragging their feet nevertheless, and they would very much have wanted this war not to have happened, not least since, of course, they now are losing Ukraine, and they have the thousands and tens of thousands or millions of Ukrainians believers there. So that it's nothing in the church in this war at all, and I don't see them as a main ideologue of this war. But I may be wrong.
Thank you so much, Paul. Well, I think it's an interesting discussion going on, and there is no probably final answer, but it's interesting to see indeed the contradiction between some scholarship seeing a kind of a role of the church before the war in kind of making the ideological kind of recipe for preparing in case it would happen, and Paul's comment that are more on the kind of realistic base that the church is also losing a lot on the ground, especially in relation to its parishes in Ukraine. And we will have in the last panel a discussion on that kind of global impact. Jason, did you wanted to add something on that global kind of role of the church before the war in framing things in such a way that it would make the war legitimation easier? And then we will conclude on that.
No pressure. I'm afraid I don't have much to add there. I think that and this is something that I've been trying to piece through for a while, and it's the thoroughgoing question in a graduate course on the political life of the Russian Orthodox Church that we started this semester. I think that there is a specific problem with the confluence of territory and church, and potentially also race, that we can't ignore. So I think it is a unique problem to national orthodoxies. I don't think it means that that illiberalism must necessarily follow, but I do think, yeah, I think that if you connect ecclesiology and salvation, right? So to a national church, if you need to be a good Russian to be a good Christian, and you need to be a good Christian to be saved, there's a potential conflict of interests there. And it also allows you the rhetorical possibility of saying, well, who really is a Russian? So is it all of Russian Orthodoxy? And then you get to sort of leverage that into a theological justification of territorial expansion, and your enemies become the enemies of God. I realize it's a can of worms to say there's a problem with national churches, and Orthodoxy seems to have a lot of them, and yet we don't necessarily see this problem coming from the other, 15 Orthodox churches. So I do think that the groundwork has been there. I don't think it is something that necessarily had to happen. I don't think right, I don't know how to say it. I'm not saying there is a fatal flaw in Orthodoxy. I'm saying there's the potential for that built into the model, and a little bit of theological maneuvering can connect nationalism to salvation. And yes, I think, and I'm willing to be proven wrong, that has been there, and even before the war, we've seen movements in that direction.
Thank you, Jaden. I think was a great kind of way of concluding that you may have the fertile ground. Doesn't mean you have causality, but you have the ground can be there. So on that, it will be time for us to conclude that session. Thank you so much, Dima, Sergei, Jason, Paul, for great contribution and really wonderful discussion. And now we will be moving on the third panel, which